All right, well, here we go. Obviously, if you looked at the agenda and watched the video with the video launch, you know that we're going to be dealing with the resignation of Richard Nixon. And so, a couple things here to kind of like point out. Number one, Richard Nixon was not impeached. He was going through the impeachment process, or the impeachment process had been started, but he was not impeached. He was not removed from office that way. He ends up resigning the office of president. So he has been the only president ever to resign. So again, he was not impeached. By the time we get to the end of the presentation, I think you guys will know why he resigned, because he probably was going to be impeached. And so that's what we're going to be talking about, the Watergate scandal and the resignation of Richard Nixon. Now what's interesting, we last had Nixon winning the 1968 election. So this was kind of like the tail end of our Vietnam unit that you guys finished up last week. And if you remember, the slogan that Nixon had in 68 was peace with honor. Yeah, peace with honor. And so he kind of wanted to get out of Vietnam. He wanted to do it peacefully, but he kind of wanted to save face. And so that was where we were in 68. Nixon wins the 68 election. Peace with honor. And also, we talked about how, Nixon kind of broadened the war in Vietnam, with invading Laos and Cambodia and bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail that also went through Laos and Cambodia. So when we last talked about Nixon, it was him winning the 68 election, peace with honor, kind of expanding the Vietnam War. And so what happens is of course, that once you become president, you immediately like celebrate for like one day, and then you start thinking about and kind of planning about, how am I going to win re-election? What's going to be my game plan? What promises do I have to keep? What do I need to achieve to win the next election? And so the next election was going to be in 1972. And so as we jump ahead here, Nixon wins the 1968 election, becomes our 37th president. And then in 1972, he is up for re-election, and he is taking on a Democrat. I think he was either from South Dakota, North Dakota. I'm going to guess South Dakota. I don't remember. That might be a good on deck question too. I probably need to write that one down. The governor, where was he from? I'm pretty sure South Dakota. I don't know, but we'll figure that one out. So the 1972 re-election is going to be Nixon versus George McGovern. So these are a couple of our Facebook friends that you probably need to know: Nixon and McGovern. Also adding onto our Facebook friends are these two guys right here. Yeah. Looks like this guy right here is like living through like COVID-19, because it looks like he hasn't been to the barber in a while and his hair's getting kind of long. But anyway, these are basically two reporters, news reporters, and they worked for the Washington Post. The Washington Post is probably one of our bigger newspapers that's kind of circulated throughout the United States, along with like the New York Times. And so these two guys are Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And so at the end of the day, it's going to be the investigation of these two guys right here that's going to really put the heat on Richard Nixon. So a couple of our Facebook friends, Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein. We also have here 5 burglars, and this is going to be the root. Yeah, this is going to be the root of the Watergate scandal. These 5 burglars, what happens is, before the 72 election, so it's like we're building up to the election, kind of like right now, how things are kind of building a little bit towards Trump and Joe Biden. These 5 individuals basically break into the Democratic Party headquarters, okay? And obviously at the Democrat Party headquarters, you're going to have things like files and strategy and notes. And so the first thing is that these 5 burglars are not your typical burglars. I know, when we think of burglars today, we might think of somebody breaking into your house, stealing your TV, your stereo, jewelry, money, clothing, whatever it is. So this is not your typical burglary, because they break into the Democratic Party headquarters, and the place where the Democrats had their headquarters was at a building in Washington, D.C. And you guys may have drove by it maybe when you guys were in 8th grade and on your trip to D.C. It was a building known as the Watergate. So the Watergate is a building in Washington, D.C., and it's huge. It's gigantic. It's like an apartment complex. It's like business centers. And again, this is kind of where the Democrats had their headquarters. Okay, so 1972 election year, these five burglars, and they were nicknamed the Plumbers. So everybody kind of has a nickname, and so these five guys were known as the Plumbers, and so they were caught breaking into the Watergate building, again, home of the Democratic Party headquarters. And again, not your typical burglary, because again, they're like tapping phones. Most burglars don't break into your house and stuff and like tap your phones, but they're putting in like listening devices. They're taking pictures of like files, photocopying files. So again, this is just not your typical burglary. It's almost kind of like a covert, operation. And so these five burglars are caught breaking into this building known as the Watergate. Okay. Now, during the investigation, once these guys are like caught, is that it is found that these plumbers have connections to the Republican Party. Okay. And so now things here are now starting to crescendo a little bit, because they're crescendoing because these five burglars, as they were breaking in, it was kind of a sophisticated break-in. I mean, they had like listening devices, they had, just, cameras to ways to like take pictures of files. And so that type of burglary, there is money behind it. I mean, somebody is financing. In other words, somebody like organized these five guys, and I'm assuming these five guys are probably getting paid. It's also, my guess is they're going to get some type of cut of some type of money, you would think. So the burglary here is obviously being organized and financed by someone. I mean, somebody came up with the idea of, hey, let's take these five guys, let's have them break in the Democratic headquarters, and maybe we can figure out what the Democrat strategy is and how they're going to try to win this 1972 election. So these five guys are caught, and connections to the Republican Party, and again, they're financed by someone. And again, it's just not your typical burglary. This picture right here is the picture of the Watergate building. So as you can see, I mean, it is huge. It's a huge building. Okay. So the Watergate is just an apartment complex. It's a building in Washington, D.C. It probably has like convention centers, probably spaces for like, businesses to hold like meetings and stuff. So it's just a multi-purpose building in Washington, D.C. Now, what happens is when these five guys are caught, and what you guys probably know is that when they are being interrogated, when they are being asked questions, this is not being done in a group of five, so it's kind of like when Mr. Daly, high school principal, is investigating something. It might be like vandalism in the high school, whatever it is. And he's got like a list of maybe like 4 or 5 names, that may have like vandalized the boys' bathroom, because it always seems like the bathrooms that get vandalized are the boys' bathroom. And of course, it's always the one by Mrs. Pinkham's room that always gets vandalized. But anyway, so if Mr. Daly's doing the investigation of the vandalism of the bathroom, and he's got a list of maybe 4 or 5 names, he's not bringing those kids in together in one group. He's bringing them in individually to kind of see what each individual story is, and kind of see if the stories collaborate, if there's gaps in the story. And what happens is usually somebody will start to sing. And what it means when someone starts to sing, in other words, they start to spill the beans. And so of those 5 guys, there's a good chance that the police or the FBI doing the investigation probably thought, of the 5 guys, which one can we maybe cut a deal with that could maybe start telling us more about not just the break-in, but like who financed it, who organized it, what were you going to do with the files that you were going to take? And so of the 5, James McCord becomes the one who kind of starts to spill the beans on the investigation. And so again, this happens a lot with Mr. Daly. If he's investigating, like the vandalism in the bathroom, he got 4 or 5 names, usually somebody might spill the beans. Somebody might say, yeah, I know who did it. Here's whatever it is. And so James McCord starts to sing. And so what happens now is the burglary at first was really kind of like a small story. It wasn't like breaking news. It wasn't like front page, news story. It was just kind of a small story that just kind of continued to crescendo and continued to get bigger. And so Woodward and Bernstein, those were a couple of our Facebook friends, Washington Post reporters, started to investigate the break-in. And the more they would investigate, the more questions they would ask, it just kind of became deeper and deeper. So it kind of became like who ordered the break-in? Who helped pay the financing of these 5 plumbers? So again, they had connections to the Republican Party. We know that Nixon is a Republican. So how far up the chain of command did this break-in go? And so the Woodward and Bernstein, they are, investigating. And so during the investigation, the story kind of continues to crescendo. And it's a little bit different in the 70s because there isn't the social media that we have today that would really blow it up really quick. So immediately, of course, the White House, Nixon and his team basically denies any involvement in the break-in, and that part may be true. I mean, that may be, that Nixon didn't know anything about the break-in. It might have been, somebody else who's part of the Republican team. And so the White House denies any involvement in the break-in. But what happens is documents and stuff come up missing, changed, destroyed. There's some false information given to investigators. Now, first of all, that's one of the major first red flags is when you're giving like false information, that's almost kind of like obstructing of justice. So if you observe like a crime, in Schoolcraft and the police show up and the police ask you which way did the robbers or which way did the burglars go, and if they went like left, running away left, and exactly where the burglars went, but you told the police they went to the right and you did that on purpose, that's kind of like obstructing of justice. You can't do that. And so that's kind of like the beginning here of this investigation continue to get bigger. Now, the break-in had really nothing to do with the result of the election. So as you can see, in 1972, Richard Nixon wins in a landslide. I mean, so, even the thought of maybe needing to like break in to the Democratic headquarters, probably wasn't needed at all. So if you look at the electoral map, I mean, it is red. I mean, other than Massachusetts and the District of Columbia, Nixon wins the 72 election in a landslide. So the Watergate break-in didn't really have much to do with the election. But after the election, the break-in and the investigation did not stop. They did not go away. It kind of continued. Okay. So this is the beginning of the fall of Richard Nixon. And so what happens is what Nixon does, and every president does this, is that they record everything that goes on in the Oval Office. All conversations are recorded. That's being done for like accuracy. A lot of presidents, when they're done being president, they like to write a book or books. And so they want to be able to kind of retell stories and get them accurate. And so 6 days after the plumbers are caught, Nixon is on tape. Now, here's the key thing. He is on tape basically telling the CIA. Okay, so if I do like a ladder, I would say we got the police at the bottom here, okay? Above the police or like the FBI, okay? And then above the FBI is like the CIA. So it's kind of like a chain of command right there. And so what happens is 6 days after the plumbers are caught, Nixon on tape tells the CIA to tell the FBI to back off. In other words, what Nixon is saying to the CIA, tell the FBI to stop investigating, stop digging for dirt, let it go, just kind of like, brush it under the rug. So by Nixon telling the CIA to tell the FBI to stop doing their job, that is obstruction of justice. I mean, no one is above the law, even El Presidente. And so that's called obstruction of justice. Now, what happens is, again, is these tapes are in the White House, and Nixon had recorded all conversations. Now, the issue now is starting to become whose tapes do they belong to? Because, Nixon's going to argue that, these are his personal tapes and he can do what he wants with them. And they don't belong to anybody else. And so that kind of becomes one of the issues here is is whose tapes are they? Do they belong to the American people because the president works for the American people? Are they Nixon's? Are they private? And so it kind of became known as the smoking gun, that during the investigation it was found that Nixon had recorded all conversations. So it kind of becomes like, hey, look, Nixon, you need to hand over your tapes so the police, the FBI can listen to them and see if any crimes were committed from you or from anybody within the Oval Office. Now, as the Watergate scandal escalates, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, that's right, Spiro Agnew, he's going to be a good on that question, okay? So that's right, his name is Spiro Agnew. And he was like the former Maryland governor. So during this whole Watergate thing, Agnew has to resign. Yeah, he has to resign. So to make a long story short, Spiro Agnew was a little crooked. And so what happened was, when he was like the governor of Maryland, and as the governor, you kind of oversee like big projects and stuff, like building roads and bridges and stuff like that, and infrastructure. And so it found out that as governor of Maryland, Agnew was kind of giving these special deals and kickbacks to like family and friends. So if you happen to be like a construction company and you had connections to Agnew, you were the one that seemed like you were getting all the business of maybe rebuilding roads and stuff. And that's just, you can't do that. You just can't, you just can't do that with people's money. And Spiro Agnew has to resign. So he resigns. And so what Nixon does is that he picks Gerald R. Ford, Gerald R. Ford from Michigan, to be, I guess you could say, his vice president. And so Nixon then has now Gerald R. Ford as his vice president. So now what happens next is the investigation continues, and the investigators, the FBI, they want to hear Nixon's White House tapes, because they're like, Nixon, if you got nothing to hide, hand them over. And Nixon refuses to release his audio tapes, and he uses a term called executive privilege. At the end of the day, whether this is right or wrong, people in certain jobs have privileges that other people just don't have. You might have people who might get like a 1 hour lunch break because they just can, and somebody else may only get a half hour. So everybody kind of has like privileges and certain perks that kind of go with every job. And so the president has this thing called executive privilege. And so he kind of uses that term, executive privilege, as president, not to release his tapes. So to make a long story short, the tape issue goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is basically, again, the Supreme Court is just not going to talk about who's innocent or guilty here. It's about, the release of the tapes. And so what happens is the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, tells Nixon he has to release the tapes. And so what happens now is, as those tapes have to be released, Nixon knows what's on them. I mean, so he knows conversations. He knows about the one about telling the CIA to tell the FBI to back off. And so that's not good. And so what happens is the impeachment process had started in the House of Representatives. And so we kind of had, this is a story that's kind of faded away a little bit, excuse me, because, Donald Trump was impeached in the House of Representatives. And so, but if you're impeached in the House of Representatives, it does not mean that you're going to be fired from president, because what happens is the impeachment process goes from the House to the Senate. And then once you get into the Senate, you need like 66 votes, 2/3 votes to actually remove the president. So with like Donald J. Trump, the House, which is the majority of Democrats, voted to impeach Trump. And there's like two issues, and I forgot what they were. But then when the case went to the Senate for the trial, again, the Republicans have the majority in the Senate, like 52-48. There wasn't 66 votes, 67 votes to remove, Trump from president. But in Nixon's case, the votes were there. The crime was committed. The evidence is clear. And so as the impeachment process continues to crescendo in the House of Representatives, Nixon knows that it's going to pass the House. He's lost confidence in the Senate. And so instead of going through the whole impeachment process and then being forced to resign, being forced to be impeached, he just decides to resign. And so then Gerald R. Ford all of a sudden, becomes our 38th president from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Yeah, Gerald R. Ford. Okay. Now, one of the controversies for Ford is that when he becomes president, and again, the president kind of has this power, is to pardon certain people for maybe crimes they did. Um, and so Nixon could have been in some really big trouble because he obstructed justice, and you can't do that. And so, I mean, you could like that's like a felony. I mean, you could like go to jail if you're obstructing justice and giving false information. And so what Ford ends up doing is, Ford basically pardons Nixon and basically kind of like erases the crimes that he may have committed. So there's going to be no trial. And so pardoning is the action of forgiving or being forgiven for like an error or an offense. And Ford's argument was, whether he's right or wrong, Ford's argument was it was time to move on. The president had been removed from office. We've got other things that are more important that we need to focus on, and it's just kind of like time to kind of end it. And so it was kind of polarizing because there was a lot of people who were like, the president's not above the law, throw Nixon in jail. And then there's also people who are like, we're okay, it's done, it's over, he resigned, let's move on. So that was one of the controversies. Of Ford when he first became president. He decided to pardon Nixon, and he would not be prosecuted for obstruction of justice. Goes back to our essential question. The reasonings, I guess you could say, for the fall of Nixon, and it's kind of like, oh boy, I think there's obviously the wanting of power is possibly involved. Nixon also was probably a little bit paranoid about people coming after him and digging up dirt on him. So it's the quest for power. It's also maybe being a little bit paranoid. And it also kind of becomes with a saying that I believe in, and is that the cover up sometimes is worse than the crime. And so with a cover up, if Nixon maybe just would have let the investigation go, and if the president really did nothing wrong, like didn't order the break-in, he probably could have maybe survived and not have to deal with the impeachment. So sometimes the cover-up is worse than the crime. So it's kind of like when you mess up and you screw up, just kind of like own it and take responsibility for it. But if you're trying to lie and cover it up, sometimes that can make things a lot worse, and then all of a sudden you end up in even more trouble because you just didn't do it. So the fall of Nixon, it could be just the quest for power, it could be paranoid, it could be just just trying to cover things up, and at the end of the day, sometimes when you mess up, you just got to own it and kind of move on. So that is our big idea. So you got the information. So put that into a new living document, add your own pictures, maps, and graphs, and they'll bring week 7 to an end. The rise and fall of Richard Nixon. I'm not a crook. That might be a good video for on deck too. The I'm not a crook speech. And he was. So that is it.